and welcome to this fourth instalment in my exploration of collective bargaining and negotiations in the modern workplace. And today we're going to be moving on to the stage where the collective bargaining actually begins, as opposed to some of the background that we've been covering in the first three sessions. Okay, just to review what we covered last time, it was really looking at the importance of preparation, and I asked you to have a think about, is it possible to be too prepared? And well, hopefully your conclusion was that no, you can't be too well prepared. And we also talked about some of the issues around strategy development and negotiating style and how you make some of those decisions, and hopefully that's also been useful information for you. What we're going to really focus on this time round is what happens once you get into the negotiating room. What are the processes that happen there and what are the dynamics? And then move into some thinking about what happens if it goes wrong, because yeah, it does sometimes go wrong. It doesn't always go to plan, and there are ways that you can actually try and get out of things there. And then once you've actually reached the end of the actual bargaining process, what happens next? Because nothing stops. There's something has to come afterwards. So we'll have a look at some of the things that happen in there as well. So the usual opening for these kind of things is that there's some kind of opening position and statement is made by one of the parties. Now, where there's been a claim, particularly if it's been a joint claim, then it would normally be that the unions would be talking through that claim and explaining the logic behind why they're asking for the things that they're asking for. So that allows some questions to be asked from the management side as to what is actually being meant by certain elements of it, actually challenging some of the logic and actually getting to the bottom of what perhaps is more important. What are the priorities within that claim? And what's important is that from either union or management side is that there is reference back to the claim or to any offer that's been made prior to that. Now, it may be that you actually agree that some of the points are going to be dropped because there's not the scope to actually address them at the moment, or maybe they'll be addressed as part of a separate negotiation. As part of your preparation, you'll obviously have had a thought about your bottom line. What are you prepared to settle for? And there's a question then as to how open are you going to be about that when you get into the room. The more open you are, the more possibility there is to bypass unnecessary conversation. But there's also the risk that you might jump to settlement and thereby give away a number of bargaining positions. And an awful lot is going to rest on how trusting the relationship is between you and the other side. You also have had a thought about what your tradables are, what you're prepared to concede that's in your claim or in the proposal that you've already got prepared. But equally important is to have had a thought about what their tradables are likely to be. And there should have been something, if you've had preliminary discussions, that you've been able to explore some of those things and be fairly clear about where you might be able to go there. Of course, that doesn't mean to say that things aren't going to change once you're in the room, and you want to retain some level of flexibility with that, because there may be things that if they actually concede surprisingly, you may be able to concede something else that you weren't necessarily expecting to. It's worth bearing in mind as well that the more aggressively you behave, the more aggressively they are likely to respond. It's part of human nature. That's not to say that there aren't circumstances where that needs to be done, where you need to be assertive and make it absolutely clear that this is a genuine priority. But simply behaving aggressively, certainly in my experience, is very rarely a good route to actually getting a satisfactory settlement. The other thing to bear in mind, and this again is more an issue for the management side, is to remember that there are going to be deals that they are going to offer that are going to be much easier for the union to sell than something else that might come onto the table. And it's worth bearing in mind that anything that goes onto the table will have to be run past the membership at some point, whether it's formally or informally. So therefore, having an outcome from the negotiation that the union can sell easier is actually a big benefit. One thing that management should never ever do though is never to claim that they know what the union members think better than the unions do, that will be taken as a very aggressive statement by the unions, because effectively what you're doing is you're saying that they are not representative of their membership. And that's usually a statement that's the start of an argument. Never forget about the balance between positions and interests. Now, I know this is something that you've covered earlier in the course as well, but I thought this was a really good illustration of it, because it's very easy to get caught up in all of the position statements, all of the discussions that are based on the political aspects of things, when actually the bulk of what's actually relevant are the interests. And it's very easy to miss those. And the interests are generally common between both sides. So always remember that. So the question is, what do you do if it all goes wrong? And unfortunately, these things, they will sometimes go wrong. So think about, what is the dispute resolution process? If there isn't a dispute resolution process, if you're not currently in dispute, this might be a good time to start thinking about negotiating one. And that's whether or not you're on the union side or the management side. It's always easier to come to agreement on these things when you're not actually having the argument that they're there to help resolve. And within that, there should be a whole range of different approaches that can be available in order to get to some kind of solution. The most common one probably is some form of escalation, whether that's taking the situation to a higher level of management, maybe as has happened in some of the organisations where I've been negotiating, where it's been lay representatives who have actually led the initial negotiations, and it's then escalated to senior management and the full-time union officers in order to try and reach some kind of settlement there. Of course, before you get to that, it may be that you simply haven't explained well enough the justification for your position. Perhaps the other side don't quite understand, so there may be some value in reiterating the case. I wouldn't say just by saying the words all again, but by coming up with a clearer explanation. And actually, it might be worth asking them what their understanding is of your position, so that you can actually identify if there is a misunderstanding, so that you can cover that. Of course, the other thing is that you could go to conciliation. I've already mentioned about how ACAS, or the Labour Relations Agency, could help out with that kind of thing. And there are other conciliators available as well. But it could just be that having a third party there to help you reach some kind of agreement between you might be useful. And it's a different form, I suppose, of reiteration, because it allows somebody else to put your arguments into words that may be understood better. The other thing would be to potentially go to arbitration. As I said when I was explaining about arbitration in a previous recording, it's a relatively unusual one, because it effectively means that both parties have to give up an awful lot of the control over the outcome of the process. So it's not something that's actually all that common, or is actually favoured by many people. Something that probably happens more often now than it used to in the past, though, is imposition, or from the managerial point of view, implementation of an offer that is seen as the best that they can actually offer. And that would often be imposition of the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So you've got to a stage where things are on the table, it's either been agreed, it's not been agreed, what happens next? Well, the next steps are, when is the agreement that you've just reached valid until? If it's an annual pay negotiation, maybe it's only valid for 12 months. Maybe you've agreed a 2 or a 3 year deal though. So when is it going to be reviewed? So that is to be discussed. The other thing is, if it's a policy or a procedure, then you would probably want to come back and review it after a period of time anyway. So agree when that review is going to take place, and then it can come back into the negotiating timetable. Are there any elements that you may want to come back and address? Because it may be that through the pay negotiations you've agreed to drop off one of the issues that was in the claim. For example, maybe a new flexi-time system was part of the claim, but you've agreed that that will be discussed at a separate negotiation, in which case that needs to be timetabled in as well, and come back and address it so that things don't get missed. It's also extremely useful to have a discussion about who does or says what. And I would suggest that that would, as best practice, be done as part of the closing off of the actual negotiations. So what are the unions going to say to their membership? What are management going to say to the wider staff? And how is it actually going to be communicated out to the wider population? It's not necessarily obvious how the unions are going to consult their members. Membership consultation can be done by mass meetings, it can be done by a postal ballot or an email ballot, but all of those different methods have different timescales involved and will need to be taken into consideration as part of the implementation of the process. So in that, it's useful to discuss within the negotiations what information is actually going to go out to the membership. What recommendation are they putting on it? Is it going to be recommendation to accept the offer or reject the offer? Or are they going to say that it's the best that can be negotiated? Question as well is, if there's a ballot going on, what's the timescale for that? Because that can have a big implication in terms of the organisation making any kind of payment, especially if there are back pay to be calculated. Or if the pay increases are complex in the way that they can be applied, then there's going to have to be some time set aside to actually feed that into the payroll system. And that's worth knowing up front. The other question is, can the unions actually help with the rollout or implementation? If you're coming to a positive settlement and a win-win, a positive agreement, then actually could the communication of that be done jointly? Or could there be some other form of rollout or implementation plan that's agreed with management and unions collaborating on doing so? And it's definitely always worth having a think about that. So finally, what happens next? Well, because things never actually come to a complete close, the next thing is you need to get ready to do it all over again the next time you come to a negotiation. And that's one of the true natures of collective bargaining.